All right, so welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Overlooked Obstacle, How Satisfactory Academic Progress Policies Impede Student Success and Equity. I'm going to start with just some logistical details. So I see a lot of people are using the chat, which I know you're all accustomed to probably from your time on Zoom meeting. If you have questions during the presentation, we do ask that you use the Q&A panel rather than the chat. So you should see on your control panel an option for Q&A, and it'll pop up a box that lets you ask a question. This will make it a lot easier for us to be able to track questions that you might have and will allow us to respond in a way that everybody can see the answers if it's a question that's applicable to everyone. So, we're not going to be monitoring the chat closely. We're going to be monitoring the Q&A. So if you do have something you want to make sure that we see, please make sure to send it through the Q&A. We do also have the chat feature if there's something you need to communicate directly to us, if you're having a technological issue or something, but you can send those questions through the Q&A as well. This webinar is being recorded, and we're going to be posting all of the materials at our website, jbay.org, following the presentation. We will be sending out the full report as well as a copy of these slides, so everybody will have access to that following the webinar.
Debbie, can I, we can see your desktop. Can you either maximize the show, the PowerPoint?
Thank you so much. I must have hit the wrong screen.
There we go. Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Thank you for those who pointed that out. All right. So I am so excited about our presenters today. We really have like just the rock star group of panelists. I'm joined by my colleague, Amy Lemley from John Burton Advocates for Youth, Gina Brown with the Community College Chancellor's Office. We have Brittany Slates with Sierra College, and I want to give a special shout out to our students, Tisha Ortiz and Josh Burns, who I am incredibly grateful to for being willing to join us today and share about their own personal experience. So thank you to all of you, and especially to the students. I did want to also just acknowledge a couple other folks. So Educational Results Partnership is the organization that helped us doing the data analysis that's presented in the report. So I want to give a shout out to them. Sarah Potter, my colleague who wasn't able to join us on the webinar today, co-wrote this report with me. So shout out to her for all her hard work. And to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here. We have a great crowd, so we're really excited. So before we jump into the actual findings and recommendations, I'm going to give just a little bit of background. So I know I'm kind of speaking to the converted with this slide here, but sometimes we do get the question about why we're so focused on higher education. And every so often I see these articles in the newspaper that are like, is college really worth it? And those kinds of things, which just drive me a little crazy. And I just want to remind folks that, in today's economy, in today's world, access to higher education is so important for everybody in our society. So the chart on the left just shows the difference in salaries there. The difference between a high school diploma and a bachelor's degree over somebody's lifetime amounts to over $1 million. So it's quite substantial, the financial benefits on average. In addition, the chart on the right shows the change in the job market from 2008 through 2016, basically the last recession, the one before the pandemic shutdown. And you can see here that what happened during that time is that for those who had a bachelor's degree, there was pretty much no job loss during the recession. Those individuals were in good shape. And since then, the number of jobs available to people with a bachelor's degree has gone up by 8.6 million jobs. In contrast, there were about 5.5 million jobs that were lost during that period for individuals with a high school diploma or less. And those jobs never came back. You can see that green line down there at the bottom. And then for those with an associate's degree or some college, the orange line in the middle, you can see there was some dip, and then there's been an increase since then. And these trends have only continued over time. So the value of post-secondary education is only going up. The necessity of education beyond high school is only increasing. I also want to just share that when we talk about post-secondary education or college, I want to be clear that we're talking about the whole range of post-secondary options that are available to students. So this is not just a four-year bachelor's degree path. This could be an associate degree. It could be a career or technical education path leading to some sort of vocational certificate. So there's short-term credential programs. So when I use the word college or I use the word post-secondary education, just to be clear, we're talking about the whole range of educational paths that are available after high school. The next kind of just introductory kind of framing point that I want to make has to do with the concept of equality versus equity. And many of you probably have seen this picture before, but it's one that I just happen to love. There could be a situation, and this is certainly the case with SAP, where there's a policy that's applied equally across the board. And so one can say, well, we're applying this policy equally. We have equality. Everybody's treated the same. That's not the same as equity, because not everybody is coming in with the same circumstances. And so if everybody has the same size box to stand on, then one person can see the game, somebody else has to stand on their tippy toes, and somebody else can't see the game at all. Whereas if you provide different folks with different supports and services and resources based on what their needs are, then everybody has an equal opportunity to see the game, and that's equity rather than equality. And that's going to be really important as we consider this issue of satisfactory academic progress. The last kind of framing point I want to make has to do with what I refer to as the student success puzzle. So this webinar obviously is focused on satisfactory academic progress. Satisfactory academic progress is one piece of what's necessary for students to be successful. So it's obviously not the only thing, but it's a really important one. And of course, having adequate financial aid and support services and having assessment policies that are data-driven and available academic counseling, and there's all kinds of different things that go into student success. SAP happens to be one that tends to be overlooked, hence the name of our report, The Overlooked Obstacle. And so we felt like it was really important to shine a light on this particular issue, but that's not to say certainly that it's the only issue out there impacting student success. And, just to note that these various issues are not mutually exclusive. We can fight for more financial aid and changes to SAP policies at the same time. It's not an either or situation. So what is SAP? What are we talking about? Many of you are probably familiar with what SAP is, but I'm just going to give a little bit of a background for those who maybe aren't as familiar. So satisfactory academic progress. I call it SAP. Some people call it SAP. SAP is one syllable, SAP is three, so I call it SAP. And there's basically three elements to SAP. So the first is GPA. Campuses are required to have a policy that sets some sort of minimum standard for GPA in order for students to be able to maintain access to financial aid. Now, the most common one of these we see is a 2.0 GPA. However, as I'm going to talk about later in this presentation, it's not necessary that it be a 2.0 GPA, and it's not even necessary that it be the same GPA for every year that somebody's in school. But there is a requirement that be some sort of GPA standard as part of SAP. Second is maximum time frame. This is set by federal law. There isn't flexibility around this particular one. So the maximum amount of time a student can receive federal financial aid is the equivalent to 150% of the published length of the program. So in other words, let's say it's a 2-year degree program that requires 60 units. That student can only receive financial aid for up to 90 units worth of time, 150% of that maximum time frame. And then finally, the completion rate, which is linked to the maximum time frame. Students have to be completing their courses at a rate that will allow them to complete in the maximum time frame. So if you have the same completion rate standard for each year, this ends up being 67%. Students have to complete at least 67% of their courses. This is the standard that is most typical, but again, there are actually ways to structure that completion standard differently to be more accessible to students, and we're going to talk about that later. But those are sort of the three elements to what goes into satisfactory academic progress. And again, you know, institutions then do have a fair amount of flexibility within those standards. So what happens when somebody doesn't make SAP? So basically, institutions have the option to either evaluate SAP at the end of the year or at the end of each term. And the graphic here on the slide shows what happens at an institution that evaluates every term. So after the first term, a student doesn't meet the SAP standard. As they go into their second term, they're placed on what's called a warning status. They can maintain their financial aid while they're on warning status. But if they don't make SAP for that second term, then the financial aid is terminated. And as they go into their third term, the only way that financial aid at that point can be reinstated is through an appeal. Now, an institution that evaluates every year, this is going to look a little bit different because there is no warning period. After that first year, financial aid is terminated and can only be reinstated through appeal. And I'm going to say a little bit about the appeal. So what is in law and regulation about appeals is that institutions can create their own appeals policies, and it allows for appeals based on death of a relative, an injury or illness of the student, or special circumstances as determined by the institution. So that last piece is really crucial, of course, because institutions have a lot of flexibility to define what constitutes special circumstances. And we're going to talk about that a little later, about sort of the opportunities that that creates to help support students to continue to have access to financial aid. If a student is placed on probation because of a successful appeal, if they don't make SAP during that probationary period, or they don't meet the terms of their academic plan, at that point, they're then terminated from financial aid. The only way that they can regain eligibility from that point is that they need to make SAP again. So their cumulative GPA and course completion rate has to align with the institution's SAP policy in order for financial aid to be reinstated. So that's SAP in a nutshell. I'm going to talk a little bit about where this came from, because I think this is really important to understand. So efforts to ensure that students from low-income families had the opportunity to attend post-secondary institutions began in the 1960s with the establishment of the Pell Grant, at that time known as the Basic Educational Opportunity Grant. In the 1980s, however, a political philosophy was taking hold that featured a reduction in the role of government, an emphasis on personal responsibility, and this development of a distinction between the quote unquote deserving and undeserving poor. So for example, changes to social safety net programs, like what's now known as TANF, the welfare programs, featured an imposition of new eligibility restrictions, work requirements, time limits. This was kind of the whole philosophy of the 80s. Financial aid programs were also modified during the same era to adopt a similar philosophy. So the Government Accountability Office looked at 20 post-secondary institutions and decided, based on a methodology that was never publicly shared, that the academic policies were too lenient and inconsistently enforced. That's what they said. And so despite the fact that there wasn't any clear data as to what even that meant, there was a recommendation that the federal government impose these satisfactory academic progress standards in 1983. Those were put in place and they have not been modified in the 40 years since. We've been working with these same policies. In 2011, there were some changes at the regulatory level where new regulations were put in place. And in fact, what these regulations did, in large part, they kind of created more consistency across institutions across the country in how SAP was implemented. But in doing so, they actually reduced the flexibility that campuses had. And in some cases, campuses had structured their policies to allow students to continue to receive financial aid for as long as 24 months for 2 years before being disqualified. These new regulations universally limited the timeline to what we have today, no more than 2 consecutive terms or 1 academic year. Such a change, was warranted perhaps in certain cases where there may have been for-profit proprietary institutions that were taking advantage of this in a way that wasn't to the benefit of students. But the broad scope of this adjustment likely also reduced flexibility in other cases where that type of flexibility may have been justified. So for low-income students whose academic prospects are already precarious just based on the lack of resources available to them, ongoing access to financial aid, we know, is absolutely essential to their ability to remain enrolled. However, as we're going to be describing in just a couple of minutes, a full quarter of first-year students in California are at risk of losing financial aid because of SAP standards. Other national studies have found this number to be as high as 40%. Over the past 40 years, since these SAP standards were implemented, the student body in the US has become more racially and ethnically diverse and includes a greater proportion of first-generation students, student parents, students who are exiting incarceration. There's such a diversity of our student population now. Despite the changing life circumstances of our students and the enormous impact that SAP requirements have had on students' access to financial aid, the existence of these standards has remained largely unquestioned. There's been virtually no research that's been conducted to evaluate the impact of these standards, and little attention has been paid to how these standards might be exacerbating social inequities and whether these standards should be re-examined. And so we're very excited about this report, really highlighting something that has been very, sparsely discussed for the 40 years that it's been in existence. So I'm going to just comment a little bit about COVID-19. It's kind of hard to do anything these days without recognizing the impact that COVID-19 has had. There have been some temporary changes to SAP rules that have been implemented as a result of the pandemic. The first is that shortly after the pandemic was first declared as a health emergency back in March 2020, the Department of Education updated the definition for the basis of a SAP appeal and noted that circumstances related to COVID-19 would be valid grounds for a SAP appeal, even if that wasn't in the institution's existing policy. This was later updated to include not only illness of a student or family member, but things like economic hardship, added work hours, loss of childcare, inability to access Wi-Fi, which is very interesting because so many students face these types of circumstances before the pandemic, and they weren't necessarily considered a valid circumstance for appeal, but the pandemic really highlighted that these circumstances, in fact, should be recognized as valid bases for an appeal. There were a couple other changes that were made. The ability to exclude from the SAP calculation any courses that a student didn't complete as a result of the public health emergency. So a student had to drop out midterm, that withdrawal wasn't counted against them in the subsequent SAP calculation. And then finally, when emergency aid was first made available to institutions to provide to students, it was linked to federal financial aid eligibility, meaning that a student on SAP disqualification didn't qualify a student to access emergency aid. That guidance was subsequently revised, and so it's no longer linked to financial aid eligibility, and so a student who's on SAP disqualification can now get access to that emergency aid that post-secondary institutions have available. The other thing I just want to note in terms of COVID-19 is that even once we get to the point where the health emergency is over, we know that the repercussions of the pandemic are going to ripple through educational systems for years. High school students had educational delays as a result of school closure. And so in thinking about how the pandemic is going to be impacting students, we're really going to be urging the Department of Education to not abandon some of these temporary changes, but in fact, to make them permanent, because the impact of the pandemic is not going to go away as soon as the health emergency is over. All right, so that's kind of my framing and background. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and take us to talk about the impact of SAP. Before I turn it over to my colleague Amy, who's going to share the results of our study, I'm just going to share a little bit about the research that we did find that was out there. So there are two studies that we found that look at the impact of SAP. The first study, which is really the only quantitative study that expressly examined this issue, used administrative data from the National Postsecondary Student AIDS Survey, along with closer examination of data from 50,000 Pell Grant recipients who were first-year community college students. It found that 1 in 5, 21%, were at risk of losing their Pell just due to the GPA criteria alone. At public community colleges, approximately 25% of first-year Pell recipients failed to attain the 2.0 GPA in both national and state administrative data. At the four-year institutions, they actually showed similar GPA failure rates. It was about 24%. So not that big a difference between the community college and the 4 years. When they factored in the credit completion requirement, the rate of SAP failure for the first year for students actually was close to 40%. So in really high numbers. What the study also found is that the biggest impact of SAP was a drop in enrollment, students not returning. And you're going to see that you'll see that our research found something very similar to this. And so you can see from the chart here that what happens is that while the rate of SAP failure progressively declines each year, this is not because students are improving their GPAs overall, although some of them, of course, do, but because many of these students simply do not re-enroll. And those who fail SAP are disproportionately more likely to drop out. So you can see that the biggest drop in enrollment comes between the spring of the first year and the following fall, which is correlated to the point that financial aid is going to be withdrawn. There was also a qualitative study that we found that was really interesting. And this was a study that was just published in 2021, so very recently, and relied on semi-structured interviews with community college students who were or were not making SAP to better understand the differences between those two groups. The study noted that the SAP criteria adopted, as I mentioned, in the early 1980s, and I'm going to quote from the study here, appear to reflect a middle-class lens. In other words, families are able to support students, students can primarily focus on their studies, and students' lives are relatively stable with minimal disruptions, and do not appear to be based on any scientific evidence. So what the researcher found was that there were no differences in the level of motivation between the students who made SAP and those who didn't. The differences between students who make SAP and students who don't make SAP is that, number one, students who didn't make SAP had significantly more life responsibilities. So they were student parents, they had employment, they had other family responsibilities. They were more likely to have fewer resources, so didn't have reliable family support, didn't have access to transportation, were facing food or housing insecurity, didn't have access to things like flexible work schedules. Thirdly, they had less access to cultural capital, so they didn't have the same amount of support to help them understand how to navigate college both inside and outside the classroom. And then finally, students who didn't make SAP had greater feelings of powerlessness, typically as a result of experiences such as homelessness, involvement in the child welfare system, witnessing family abuse, or extreme family hardship. And so the author found, and again, I'm going to quote from her here because she said it so well, the SAP criteria do not appear to produce an incentivizing effect, and perhaps more than producing a discouraging effect, create a substantive barrier for financially eligible Pell Grant community college students. She goes on to note that the criteria divided students between those who had access to resources and those who didn't, those who had access to cultural capital and those who didn't, and those whose life experiences had engendered feelings of powerlessness. And what we see, therefore, is that the SAP criteria really end up reproducing the inequities that already exist throughout our systems. So penalizing the poor, penalizing those who don't understand how the system works, and furthering the disempowerment of those who have had traumatic childhood experiences. And that ends up being what SAP does, rather than really gatekeeping in an effective way, students who are trying to take advantage of the system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy, who's going to tell you about the study that we did.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I also want to just really encourage everyone. This is a very exciting report. Debbie and Sarah put a lot of work into it, and the references for the study that Debbie just discussed, as well as a lot of other references, are included in the report. So what you're getting here today is kind of a sampler plate, but we hope that you'll take the time to have the full 3-course, 53-page meal when you have time. So yes, I'm going to talk about the study that was conducted here in partnership with Education Results Partnership. As many of you on today's web seminar know, the California Community College system is the largest public post-secondary education system in the country. It serves over 2.1 million students across 116 campuses. And so this is the system we wanted to understand the impact of SAP on. And so to do this, we received aggregated data from the CalPass Plus system, which is managed by Education Results Partnership. And that included all students who enrolled in a California community college for the first time in the fall of 2017 and received a Pell Grant. The cohort included a total of 76,125 Pell Grant recipients. And as you can see from the figure on the right-hand side, it is disaggregated by race and ethnicity. Hispanic students represented the largest subpopulation at 59%, followed by white students and Black students. Now, the California Community College system also includes a flag for students who self-identify as having experience in the foster care system. Data for this specific subpopulation was also disaggregated, and that included 2,053 first-year Pell Grant recipients. Now, as many of you on today's webinar know, numerous studies have demonstrated that foster youth experience poor educational outcomes far below those of their peers. And for that reason, our organization had a specific interest in looking more deeply at the impact of SAP on this specific student subpopulation. So with this group of students identified, again, first-time students who entered in the fall of 2017 and received a Pell Grant, we worked with Education Results Partnership to create a proxy for SAP based on whether the student had maintained a cumulative 2.0 GPA and a 67% course completion rate at the end of each semester. Because these are, while they're not uniformly used across all institutions, they are the measures that are most commonly used. And this proxy measure was then used to identify students not making SAP and to follow their academic trajectory into the following academic year. So Debbie, next slide. Let's jump into the results. So as you can see from this slide, those who remained enrolled for the full year, roughly 1 in 4 students did not make SAP during both the fall and spring terms, thus disqualifying them from obtaining a Pell Grant, along with most other state and federal financial aid without a successful appeal. On all the different rows, you can see that 24% on average, but you can also see there were very different effects across groups of race and ethnicity. Black and Native American students did not make SAP at a rate double that of white and Asian students. And if you look at the foster youth here, over 1/3 did not make SAP. We also, now this figure isn't on the slide, but we also looked at foster youth by race and ethnicity and looked specifically at what subpopulations of foster youth were not making SAP. And a full 42% of Black students with experience in foster care did not meet SAP in both terms. And again, this additional information is included in the report, but that one, given that high rate, was one we wanted to specifically call out. Next slide, please. Now we looked at what percentage of Pell Grant recipients who enrolled for the first time in fall 2017 were not enrolled after their first year. So this is, again, for all of those students that were on that first slide. And as you can see, overall, by the time these students reached their second year of college, 32% were no longer enrolled. They disenrolled. But again, as with the prior slide, we see different effects for different kinds of students. Students who identified as Pacific Islander, Black, or foster youth were the least likely to remain enrolled, all with disenrollment rates between 45 and 48%. Now, while some students may have disenrolled due to a positive outcome, such as completing a short-term certificate program, it is more likely that these students left college without having achieved their desired educational goal. Next slide, please. But then really to the point of this study, we wanted to look at students who had not made SAP. So we looked specifically at those students who had not made SAP. And for these students, the rate of disenrollment after their first year of school was 3 times the rate for those who do achieve SAP. So you see here on the slide, 58% of students who did not meet SAP for 2 consecutive terms were not enrolled after that first year, as compared with 18% who did achieve SAP. So this was very notable for us. This is a stark contrast, clearly indicating the profound impact of SAP on student retention. Next slide, please. Now, as Debbie noted in her introduction, failure to meet SAP results in a loss of financial aid unless a student makes a successful appeal. And so we are very curious to see, is this translating? Are individuals who are losing their financial aid? Now, given the considerable number of Pell Grant recipients who are not making SAP, we wanted to examine how many of these students are losing financial aid. And as you can see from the slide, there is a notable drop in the individuals who are continuing to receive financial aid. The chart on the left shows the percentage of different student populations who lost their financial aid in the second term of enrollment, which was the spring of 2018. Now you can see from the figure on the right-hand side, Pell Grant loss increases considerable for students in the fall of 18, which is their third term. So you can also see, significant differences within those different student populations. On average, 35.9% of Pell Grant recipients who entered in the fall of 2017, again, we're going back to that original cohort that we identified, were no longer receiving a Pell Grant really by the fall of 2018. So within one academic year, over a third of students had lost their Pell Grant, with Hispanic students and Black students more likely than the average student to have lost their Pell Grant. Now, while there are various reasons that student could lose access, such as no longer meeting income or asset criteria, or failing to complete a FAFSA, this significant increase in Pell loss following the first year points to the likelihood of SAP's significant effect on whether students retain their Pell Grant. Okay, next slide, please. Now, next, we look specifically at those students who made SAP and compared them to those who did not make SAP. And that's what you see on this slide here. As you can see from this slide, less than 1 in 4 students who did not make SAP were receiving a Pell Grant in their third term, as compared to 74% of students who made SAP. So the students who did continue to receive financial aid likely did so due to a successful appeal. However, you can see that's really not the case for a healthy percentage of students. Some would argue that SAP is doing its job. Students who did not meet SAP are in fact losing that financial aid. And we examined that because we really wanted to explore the kind of extent to which that appeal process is utilized and is preventing students from losing their financial aid. So next slide, please. So now we want to combine the impact of SAP on enrollment and Pell Grant receipt. And when we did this, it was significant. So by their second year, as you can see on this slide, 87% of students who did not meet SAP had either disenrolled or lost their Pell Grant. The implication of these data is that SAP standards have an enormous impact on whether students who struggle academically during their first year have equitable access to the resources needed to continue their academic pursuits. So kind of stated conversely, just 13% of students who did not make SAP during their first 2 terms were able to successfully navigate the appeals process to retain aid and remain enrolled. So 13 out of 100. 100 students go through that door. After, of those who did not, only 13% are able to be enrolled and maintain their Pell Grant. And so for us, and hopefully for many of you on today's web seminar, this data really points to a need to better understand current barriers to successfully use the appeals process and corresponding academic planning to enable students to maintain financial aid and move towards academic success. Students may be unaware of the option to appeal or may not be equipped to navigate the process without assistance. The imposition of deadlines may limit some students' options, and stringent criteria for a valid basis of appeal may also discourage students from pursuing appeal or result in a large number of students being denied. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back to Debbie.
All right, thanks so much, Amy. I'm going to ask Gina Brown now with the California Community College Chancellor's Office to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I want to take this opportunity to thank you and your team, as well as everyone at John Burton Advocates for Youth, for their commitment to students of California. And of course, I mentioned California students. I'm a product of California community colleges. I work for the Chancellor's Office. I worked at a college. I have enough units at community colleges to have a couple associate's degree. And I even got denied an SAP appeal back in the 90s when I needed financial aid at a community college. So this really hits home for me. Of course, I only have a few things to say because I'm really anxious to hearing from the 2 most important people on this panel, and that's our students. But first, I just wanted to say that we know that before the pandemic, too many California community college students, and that's students everywhere across our nation, struggle with basic needs and securities, right? The pandemic further exposed economic and social disparities. We know that financial aid not only has a significant role in improving student outcomes, but financial aid and basic needs support systems go hand in hand. And we know without satisfactory SAP, there is no financial aid. So ensuring equitable access to financial aid is critical to helping students address housing, food, and health unmet needs. We know that national system and local research suggests that many students are not receiving maximum financial aid disbursements for many reasons, and one of them is SAP. And to ensure that students maximize aid receipt, administrators, those of us who administer financial aid, must balance making processes student-focused while serving as stewards of federal, state, and institutional policies. For everyone in systems of higher education, we have to really think about transforming our culture. What we need is a paradigm shift. We need to move from a primary focus on compliance and traditional values and policies to a focus on empowerment and equity for our diverse students who may not have those not so traditional needs. These are needs that include, of course, housing and food stability, childcare, mental health services, maybe even things like expanded service hours or extended deadlines. Institutions as a whole should adopt an overarching philosophy of responsibility for the well-being of students with policies and programs with inclusive values. But the question is, how do we make that paradigm shift, right? The answers range from relatively simple to very complex and include federal and state policy reform, advocacy at all levels, and local needs assessment supported by student-focused equitable policies. Oh, and thank you, Summer. She just mentioned it's not just California. It's it's definitely nationwide, no question. I just want to make sure we put that out there. I'm just, California's in my blood. But anyway, back, how do we make that paradigm shift? You know, the information presented in today's webinar is one way to start that shift. All of us as individuals I encourage you all to embrace the responsibility that you have in the work of creating equitable student-focused policies. And I just want to put out there are some considerations to design for when you're designing for equitable outcomes. And those are built into the Chancellor's Office Vision for Success commitments, but these are universal commitments, right? Aside from understanding the statutory minimum requirements, we have to focus relentlessly on student goals, always design and decide with the student in mind, foster the use of data, inquiry, and evidence, really take ownership of the goals and student outcomes. And this is probably the most important one, enable action through thoughtful innovation. You know, after the information that was presented in our webinar and hearing from the students, I challenge you to learn, act, and then change. Learn, leverage all the various resources available to you. Go back and reread the SAP chapter in the FSA handbook. It's volume 1, chapter 1. Even if you think you know what's there. I've been in financial aid for over 20 years. Every time I look at that handbook, I learn something new. If you have access to NASFA, consult the Ask Regs feature. Learn from our student advocacy groups like JBank that has done a lot of this work already. Ask your peers at your sister schools. Ask your distant cousin schools. Ask the questions courageously and unapologetically. Okay? Once you learn, act, be innovative, like I mentioned, revise your SAP policies to eliminate unnecessary obstacles. Don't be afraid to aspire to make every single process of administering financial aid as focused on student needs as possible. Do you have an appeal deadline? If yes, really determine what's the purpose of that deadline and is it really serving the students? Think about your completion rates and the minimum GPA included in your policy. Would graduated completion rates benefit your students? Consider the documents you'll accept as verification for the reason for an appeal. And lastly, I want you to be an agent of change. While you're reviewing your SAP policy, I want you to feel empowered to ask others for their feedback and evaluation. Ask non-financial aid staff or faculty to review your policy. You could be really progressive and put together a focus group made up of students to evaluate your SAP policy. And please note, I'm only emphasizing SAP because it's in the title of the session, right? But every single campus process should be just as focused on student needs. Encourage your colleagues in student services and across the campus to do the same. My bottom line, completion not only benefits students, but society and the economy by improving family income. We saw that on the earlier slides, what the income could be with a college degree, right? Reducing reliance on public welfare, lowering incarceration, while at the same time developing a highly skilled workforce that employers desperately want and need. Right? We need to simplify the supports for student stability, use our resources and structures and package them to simplify, to be simple and to help students meet their basic digital and financial aid needs. So that's me, that's my soapbox. I hope you all do feel empowered. I want to invite anyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me after this webinar. But at that, I would like to turn it back to Debbie, because like I said, I really want to hear from our students.
Thank you so much, Gina. And I see, there's some questions coming in about what we should do about this, and we're going to get to that in a minute, so stay tuned. But first, I want to bring up Tisha Ortiz, one of our student panelists, who's going to just share a bit about her own personal experience. So to start, Tisha, can you just give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Well, I went into the foster care system at age 4 until I was 8, and then re-entered at age 12 and emancipated at 18 without support. Went into CSU East Bay as a freshman.
Great. Okay, so you were in the foster care system. Sounds like you didn't have a lot of support available to you when you left, but you managed to get into a Cal State University, which is fantastic, as a freshman. Congratulations on that. But then what happened to you once you first entered CSU East Bay?
I became homeless twice within the first year, was living in a homeless shelter and didn't have stable internet or computer access and couldn't do classwork. Didn't know about SAP or the impact on financial aid and withdrew from classes. End up losing my financial aid.
Then what happened after you lost your financial aid that first year?
I appealed and got financial aid back, got into transitional housing, but became homeless again, failed again after a year, and so transferred to Ohlone Community College in Fremont, California, and was restated on financial aid, was in stable housing and got A's and B's, and was reaccepted to CSUEB as a transfer student.
Okay, so what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that you became homeless, which really negatively impacted your academics. You lost your financial aid because of SAP. You ended up getting your financial aid back, but you became homeless a second time. So you've really faced quite a lot of challenges through your academic career. So you decided to go back to community college, or go to community college, where you were able to get financial aid back. And once you got into stable housing at the community college, you did quite well. You got A's and B's and really were strong academically, and that allowed you to get back into Cal State East Bay, so which is great. Congratulations on that as well. But then I know that when you got back to Cal State East Bay, you had some additional challenges. So tell us about what happened when you finally were able to return to Cal State East Bay.
Had to appeal my financial aid to be able to get financial aid back, had more support, lived in dorms, and was doing well in maintaining grades, but became homeless again when I had to move out of the dorms. I failed classes and lost SAP again and had to disenroll. And I was out for 2 years, had to reapply to the institution again, got back in for spring 2021, but without financial aid. Department of Rehabilitation paid for my tuition last semester, and I got straight A's last semester. I will be moving into the dorms this fall and need financial aid to pay for dorms and finish program. Not yet clear if financial aid will be reinstated for the fall, so I might have to reappeal. Less than 24 units left to complete, and I have a 2.6 GPA currently.
So you've been through a lot of ups and downs, Tisha, and it sounds like access to housing has really been at the core. Can you just say a couple words about sort of, what it was like when you had housing and how you were able to be successful at college, and then, what it was like when you lost housing and how that impacted your ability to be successful in classes and therefore your financial aid?
Well, when I was not homeless, I was able to focus on school and not worry about where I was going to eat or sleep. And I was able to have access to internet. So I was able to do my classes very well, especially with the pandemic. This last semester was all online. So I was able to finish that and get straight A's. But when I wasn't homeless, I was constantly worried about finishing my classes when I didn't have internet, and just worried about what I was going to eat and where I was going to sleep at night.
Yeah. So, thank you so much, Tisha, for sharing your story. I mean, I just want to note for folks, what I'm hearing from you is that your motivation to succeed is clearly very strong. I mean, you have kept with this through what, like 8 years now, I think?
10 years.
How long?
10 years.
10 years.
But I've had a few breaks in between.
Yeah. So, I don't think anybody can question your motivation to get your degree. And your capacity to be successful in college is also clearly very strong. When you're in stable housing, you have gotten A's and B's, you've done really, really well. And, I'm hearing from you that is really the lack of support and not having that kind of fallback, like you came out of the foster care system, you don't have a family support system to go to when your housing became insecure. And that's really what has exacerbated your challenges and led to the SAP problems, which has then led to how long it's taken you to complete. I mean, if you had been able to maintain financial aid straight through without sort of having these gaps, do you think you would have been able to have completed your degree sooner?
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for joining the call today. I really appreciate it. We're going to hear from our second student a little later, but before we do that, I'm going to jump into our recommendations section. So this is a question some of you have asked. What we did to develop our recommendations is we did a scan of all public 2-year colleges and 4-year universities in California, about 150 or so in total, to see what SAP policies were currently in place. And then based on this, along with a review of federal laws and regulations, we identified areas where policy and practice enhancements could be adopted in order to remove barriers for SAP, remove barriers for students in meeting SAP. So individual institutions actually have quite a lot of flexibility in how they create their SAP policies. One of the things that's in the report, which we're really excited about, is we developed what we're calling an institutional audit tool, where we kind of walk through these recommendations in a way that allows you as an institution to assess whether you have particular policies in place or not that are either posing barriers or making it easier for students. So we tried to make it really easy for you to understand your own policies and where there might be opportunity for change. I just want to note that, of course, policy change is only the first piece of the puzzle. Implementation of those policies is also crucial. So having adequate staffing, training, and resources is an essential piece of this pie. The other thing I want to note before I jump into the recommendations themselves is that every single one of these policies that we're recommending is a policy that we found at an institution. So we didn't make any of these up on our own. These are all policies that your fellow, colleagues at other institutions have put in place on their campuses. And so they've been vetted, they're all legal, they're all in compliance with the federal requirements, and they're all things that you can do. All right, so the first is that ensure that students have ample warning if they're not going to be, if they're at risk of losing financial aid. So the law requires that institutions evaluate SAP on at least an annual basis, but institutions have the opportunity to evaluate at the end of each academic term. Now, whether it makes sense to evaluate on a term basis or a yearly basis actually depends on whether your institution is a semester campus or a quarter campus. So if you're a semester campus, we highly recommend that you evaluate each term. This allows you to use this opportunity for a warning period to give students an opportunity to access services and get their standing back up so that they don't lose financial aid. If you're on a quarter system, however, if you evaluate every term, then students potentially lose their financial aid after 2 quarters. So they don't actually even get to keep their financial aid for a full year. And so in that case, it might make sense to evaluate annually. However, if you're an institution that chooses to evaluate formally on an annual basis, we recommend that you create some sort of early alert system with warning periods so that students, even if you're only evaluating SAP formally, annually, still have the opportunity to be informed that they're at risk of losing financial aid after each term or even in the middle of terms, if that's possible. The more warning students can have, the better. The next one I'm going to talk about is something that not a lot of campuses do, but that is available to you, which is implementing an escalating GPA percentage. So you don't have to have a policy that says you have to have a 2-point GPA every term. So the example here on the slide is a campus with a policy that says if you're a freshman, so this is a 4-year university, if you're a freshman, you have to have a 1.5 GPA. If you're a sophomore, it's a 1.8 GPA. And then only once you're a junior or a senior is it necessary to have a 2.0 GPA. And the FSA handbook, the Federal Student Aid Handbook, actually very explicitly says that having a standard consistent with the requirement for graduation means you can use an escalating GPA instead of a fixed one. And they give an example very similar to this. So just know that it's very explicitly authorized that you're allowed to do something like this. At a community college, this can also, what we've seen is it looks a little different. For example, we've seen campuses that say you only need to maintain the 2.0 GPA once a student's completed at least 12 units. So just as some examples here in California, Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Dominguez Hills, Cal State San Bernardino, those are 3 universities that have an escalating GPA percentage. At the community college level here, College of the Desert, Evergreen Valley College, and Imperial Valley College are 3 examples with a similar policy. One other thing I'll just note about the GPA piece is that SAP only requires you to evaluate the cumulative GPA. We did see some policies that evaluate both the cumulative GPA and the term GPA. That's not necessary. All that's necessary is that you evaluate the cumulative GPA. And so we recommend that you avoid setting a standard that's higher than the minimum federal requirement. You can do something similar with the course completion percentage. So there can be a graduated course completion percentage. So, oh, I realized I put the wrong information on the slide here. My apologies. I'll fix it before I send it out. But you can have, you know, as a freshman, the course completion rate is 50%, and then 67% as a sophomore. And, you know, you can have it escalated. Again, by the time somebody completes their program, the cumulative completion rate has to be 67%, but it doesn't have to be 67% for each year. So this is something you can also do. UC San Diego is an example of an institution at the University of California system that does something like this. So they have between 0 and 44 units. The student has to complete 30% of courses. Between 45 and 89 units, the rate is 50%. And only once a student has attempted 90 or more units does the rate rise to 66%. Butte College is an example of a community college that has something like this. So they have a 50% course completion rate for students who've attempted fewer than 18 units, and a 67% completion rate for other students. So there are, you know, a number of examples of this. Another thing that we recommend is flexibility in the evaluation of certain types of credits. And this is something that gets a little complicated, but there's a number of ways that you can adjust your policies to include or exclude certain types of classes. So, for example, you can exclude all remedial coursework from the maximum time frame calculation. So none of that needs to count towards that 150% maximum time frame. LA Mission, LA Pierce, these are a couple of campuses that do that. There's also the option to, if a student changes majors, to exclude any coursework that does not count towards the new major from the SAP determination. And so another thing you can do is stipulate that if a course is repeated, only the higher grade gets included in the GPA calculation. So Imperial Valley College, for example, has a policy like that. Another thing that you can do is actually exclude units from other institutions that don't count towards the student's educational program. So credits that are transferred in from another institution, you have a lot of flexibility about how those are treated. So in particular, when you're calculating the pace for, when you're calculating the GPA calculation specifically, you do not have to include transfer credits in that calculation. And so if that would be to the student's detriment, you can exclude that from the GPA calculation. In addition, I think this is one that's really important to understand, is that courses and grades earned at a different institution that are not being transferred into your institution can be excluded from the maximum time frame calculation. And so if somebody got, didn't get advising at their community college and took a bunch of classes, not realizing that they didn't actually count to the degree, and they don't end up being transferred when they go into the four-year institution, you don't have to count that towards that 150% maximum. You can exclude them. So for example, Cal Poly Pomona was a campus we found that automatically excludes units from any two-year institution that are in excess of 70 units from the maximum time frame calculation. Students can also file an appeal to have other transfer credits that weren't already excluded from that calculation if they don't meet any of the degree requirements at Cal Poly Pomona. So, we know that community college students often graduate with close to 90 units at the point they transfer, which is, quite a bit more than the 60 required. And so you don't have to count all those units. There's ways to exclude them to ensure that students can maintain financial aid. Another recommendation that we have is provide intrusive academic coaching. And so rather than waiting for students to come to you, to reach out to them and be proactive. If you see a student who's failing SAP, to reach out and have designated advisors who can help that student to address whatever challenges that they're facing. These types of programs has been shown in studies to result in higher retention, academic performance, more financial aid receipt. Sometimes these students, because of their history of trauma, maybe they were involved in the foster care system and did not have good experiences with adult professionals, and so they're reluctant to reach out for help. Or maybe, like Tisha, they were homeless and they're embarrassed about that. They're ashamed, they don't want people to know, and so they're reluctant to reach out for help. So if you're initiating the coaching from your end in response to these kind of early warning signs or at critical touch points, then students are more likely to be able to access the support that they need so that they can make the SAP standard and they can maintain enrollment. Next is the appeals process. So there's kind of two elements to that, the process itself and then the appeals criteria. So looking at your appeals process, evaluating, is it barrier-free and student-friendly? We recommend that you allow appeals to be submitted through a variety of means, electronic, mail, and in-person submission. We saw a lot of campus policies that provide a list of reasons that will not be considered for appeal. They would say things like lack of access to childcare or changes to your work schedule or incarceration are not considered valid reasons for appeal. And we recommend not including a list like that because that can be discouraging to students that may have a really valid circumstance. Offering assistance to students to navigate the process. This can be very confusing, especially if a student doesn't have that cultural capital that we talked about at the beginning. And so having staff available to assist students to navigate the process, help them collect the necessary documentation, etc. Processing these as quickly as possible. We recommend that appeals be processed within 30 days and that there is opportunity for a secondary review of a negative decision to make sure that appeal decisions are being made equitably. Finally, processes should be developed with the student business services to ensure that if a student does have a pending appeal, they're not disenrolled for non-payment of tuition and fees. This is something we saw at some campuses, that there's kind of a hold put on any disenrollment due to fees until that appeals process is finalized. The second piece of the appeals process is how extenuating circumstances are defined. So by including a broad range of extenuating circumstances, this allows institutions to take into consideration all the life challenges that students from more disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to face, thereby creating equitable access to financial aid. So, again, as I mentioned before, we recommend that campuses don't discourage students from requesting appeals by explicitly excluding certain things. It's interesting because we saw things like work conflicts and employment demands being excluded as circumstances. And then, of course, with COVID-19, those are now explicitly included. And so there's more of a recognition of, that those challenges are very real for many students and can have an impact on their academics. It's really no fault of their own. Incarceration is another one I want to mention because I saw some policies that specifically exclude incarceration. And in this budget that was just passed a couple of weeks ago, there's funding for a Rising Scholars program at our community colleges for formerly incarcerated students. And there's a growing recognition that our educational institutions are really a place for these individuals as they come out of the criminal justice system to have a second chance, to have an opportunity. And so we don't want to then exclude them for financial aid if we really want to be serious about giving these folks a second chance. The next recommendation is creating opportunities for students who have disenrolled and re-entered to immediately regain access to financial aid. So what we see at some campuses is that the policy says that if you, let's say you don't make SAP, you go into school right after high school, you're 18 years old, maybe you're not quite ready for the rigor of post-secondary system, you fail some classes, you drop out, you don't make SAP. 5 years later, you decide, okay, I want to go back to school, you come back to college, and what you're told is, sorry, you were on SAP disqualification when you left before, you can't get financial aid until you get back into good standing with SAP. And in some cases, a student can file an appeal to get their financial aid reinstated right away, which is what we recommend. In other cases, policies sometimes say, well, you have to go here for a term and make SAP for one term before we'll consider reinstating your financial aid. And that, of course, puts students in a catch-22 where they can't get their aid back until they're successful in school, but they can't be successful in school until they have access to financial aid. So we recommend, creating policies that allow these students to have their aid reinstated during that very first term. Riverside City College, Sierra College are a couple of campuses where we found examples of that type of policy to give those students a second chance. And then lastly, don't impose requirements beyond those required by federal law. So some of these I've already mentioned. You only have to have a cumulative measure for both GPA and course completion. So you don't need to have also individual term measures. Imposing appeal deadlines, while I totally understand from an administrative perspective how that makes life easier for staff, it can create some barriers for students. And it's actually one of the things that we've heard is one of the biggest barriers is when students don't realize that there's a deadline or they're unable to get their documentation by the deadline, and then they lose their chance to appeal and re-enroll. Imposing limits on the number of appeals. Tisha is a really good example of this. Fortunately, her campus doesn't have a limit on the number of appeals. And so she's been able to continue her academic career, even though she's had more than one bump in the road as her educational career has moved forward. Disallowing the use of financial aid for repeated courses. This is something we saw in some policies. It's not a requirement of federal law. Or creating really strict limitations on appeal circumstances, like I talked about just a minute ago. So those are the institutional recommendations. And as I mentioned, we do have this institutional audit tool that's in the report that can help you really think about all of these different policies and whether there's some that you don't have in place right now that you might want to adopt on your campus. And I'm going to talk at the end how you can also join a community of folks interested in looking at this issue. Before we do that, we're going to have our second student, Josh Burns, who's joining us from Wisconsin. So welcome, Josh. And I think you're muted right now, so I'll make sure you unmute. Great. Oops, sorry, I changed slides too fast. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Josh?
Oh, yes. My name is Josh Burns. I go to the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and my life hasn't been particularly easy. I have been poor for majority of my life. I have been to many different schools. I've been homeless 3 times, and I have struggled with a lot of mental issues, I would say. When I was younger, like I said, I was poor. I was living with my mother and my little sister, and my mother can barely afford to put food on the table. And she was working 2 jobs constantly and still was unable to support us. And eventually, she got to the point where she couldn't sustain 2 kids in the household. So I had the opportunity to move from Colorado, where I was at the time, because my mother couldn't financially sustain a home in Wisconsin. And so we were forced, per se, to go to Colorado, and we were there for a little while. And we were eventually evicted because my mother couldn't afford payments. I was there and we became homeless. And I was homeless for 8 months inside of a homeless shelter and went to a very, very, very ran down school that I'm pretty sure no one would want to go to. And like I said, I had the opportunity to move in with my older sister back here in Wisconsin because my mother couldn't financially afford to take care of 2 kids. And as soon as I got back to Wisconsin, it was a whole new story for me because I understood nothing. My sister and her kids went to a more wealthier type of school. And needless to say, as soon as I got to that school, I had no idea what was going on. Anything that they were teaching at the school, I never learned before, but to them was common sense. And through middle school, through high school, I went to that school and had to adjust to not only a dominant white community, but also an environment I've never been in before. And after all that time spending there, I actually had enough time to think about all the experiences I've had from my past. And I got a scholarship accepted to Schoolhouse Connections, and I went down to Texas to accept it. And I was 18 at the time, so my sister thought that would be the perfect idea to kick me out of her house. So I was evicted from her house while I was there in Texas accepting the award. And I was put on a homeless program, and I was invited to stay at a home of a stranger that I had no idea who was. And at that point, I skipped over this, but my mother passed away when I was 14, so I no longer had her in my life. My father was still in prison. He was in prison since I was 12, so I really had no backbone of my life. And as soon as I got through high school, because that's how long I stayed in that random person's house, I eventually had just no stability. I had no one to turn my back to, and the only thing I could focus on was college or nothing. That was all. If I didn't get to college, I knew I was back on the street. I had no choice. And so I worked my tail off in high school and eventually got accepted to the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. But I still faced a lot of struggles because now I am in a school that's even more white. I believe the statistic here is that here on campus, only 8% of people on campus are people of color, and the rest are all white. And so I'm now in an environment beyond what I was already struggling with. And needless to say, it was difficult. And I was put into a program called ASI that gave me a slight head start on what college life was like. And the story moved on from there.
Great. So, so you got this, you were in this great program, ASI, that helped you to prepare for college. And I know you shared with me before that you did really well in that program. But then once you got into college for your first year, what happened next?
So it felt like I was thrown in it, though I did have the assistance of ahead of time to get the feeling of what college is like. I still had absolutely no idea what anything was or who to reach out to. There were very few programs for people of color, and I completely struggled. I tried my butt off in every single class that I did and failed almost every single class my first semester. I eventually got a warning saying that if you don't get your grades up, you're going to have to leave. And I was like, all right, that's my kickstart. I didn't do well enough. I need to take it up a grade. Second semester starts, struggle even harder to the point where I'd even want to be on campus. And I eventually just stopped going to classes because I figured if I can't pass this, then what's the point? And eventually got to the point of where I felt that I was in whatever the word is. I was unable to succeed in classes. And I felt that for that reason, I shouldn't be on campus because clearly I'm not good enough. And so I reached out to some people and I left college with a bad GPA and eventually moved into a transitional living program because that was all that was available to me. I had no reach outs. I had no family to talk to. I was stuck.
So tell us what happened next after that.
After that, the TLP program actually ran out of funding because it seems like the funding that was given to them also was going around the country, and almost every single program in Wisconsin was canceled because they couldn't afford it. And so I was eventually evicted from that place within a week notice. And I had to move back in with my older sister. Thankfully, she allowed me to. And because without that, I was easily on the streets. I had nowhere else I could go. And I had to make a hard promise to my sister that this is only temporary. I'm going back to college. That was my turning point, is I am not staying in this situation where I'm struggling not only to get food, but have a place over my head. So I stayed there, worked until I knew I can afford to get back into college, and eventually got back into college.
That's great. Well, I'm super happy to hear that you're back in college now. And, thank you for sharing your story with us. It really just exemplifies once again the challenges that so many of our students face and why we need to have SAP policies that are flexible and ensure that students like you have an opportunity to continue their education. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany now. She's with Sierra College, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what went on there. Brittany?
Yeah, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so my name is Brittany Slates, and I am the Guardian Scholar Financial Aid Technician for our campus. And my position on campus is a little bit unique. I work at Sierra College in Rockland, California, and the college decided that there needed to be a financial aid person within our foster youth program. And so I'm a little bit of the support program for our foster youth and a little bit financial aid. And so I can do quite a few things for our students and kind of be that bridge of information and knowledge and support with both financial aid and our support program. So that's just a little bit about myself. And then I can tell you a little bit more about how that helped our campus. So some of the things that Sierra College has been doing over the last 5 or 6 years has really been looking at our institution, looking at ourselves, and looking at how we are putting barriers in front of our students. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are the benefits of a long process. And so when we're looking at our policies, we really went through and tried to see where those barriers were for our students and what we could do about it. So some of the barriers that we identified were that we had a larger number of students that were failing SAP than we wanted to. Obviously, we want all of our students to succeed, and so we were seeing that more students were failing than we wanted. Because more students were failing SAP, we had a high number of petitions for reinstating students into financial aid. And with a high number of those petitions, there were longer wait times for our students. And so it could be up to 6 weeks sometimes before a student would know if they were going to receive their financial aid or not. And obviously, if there's a delay in any process that we have or any documents that we're looking through, that's going to delay a student's financial aid and their disbursements. And then that means that, there's a delay in them receiving their books and being able to purchase, the things that they need for the semester, let alone the other things that they have going on that are not, academically related. So rent, food, all the basic needs. If we are delaying their financial aid, all of those things are delayed too. So there's this domino effect, right? And so some of the barriers that we identified were things that obviously, we can't be the fix-all in financial aid. We try really hard, we want to be, but we noticed that, both of our students today talked about, struggles with having secure housing. Working with a lot of my foster youth, that's not an uncommon, barrier that students are facing. And so while I want to just note that some of the barriers that I'm talking about here are related to SAP because that's, the conversation of the day, it's definitely not the only barriers that students are facing. And so I just wanted to make sure to point that out because it's complicated. So go ahead and next slide. So some of the SAP adjustments that we made after our process analysis and after identifying the barriers that it was creating for our students is that we had one staff member that reviewed all petitions. And that was just the structure of our office. And so one of our changes was that our director allowed all of the financial aid staff to review petitions and also to review professional judgments. And so if we had the opportunity to help a student individually and uniquely, then anyone in the office could do that. It didn't have to be one specific person because it was bottlenecking at that one person. And what if that person's on vacation or what, so there's we wanted to be able to help our students in a different way, in a more intentional way. And so all of the financial aid staff were trained to be able to do this. It not only reduced our processing time, but it also made it so that if a student had a specific, connection with somebody, or they had created a relationship with that person person didn't have to hand them off to somebody else. They didn't have to retell their story to somebody else. That was important to us. We also implemented a verification software that decreased processing time as well, which was really, really helpful. And we're continuing to utilize that resource more and more each year because it's brand new to us. So we're still doing that. But we were one of the schools that had more strict policies around SAP than the federal regulations required. And so by taking a look at our procedures and our policies, we kind of had to really look at ourselves and say like, hey, why do we do this? And we went through during this process analysis, looking at a lot of our policies and saying, hey, why are we doing this? It's not just, what are we doing or how are we doing it? But the why is really, really important. And so we decided that instead of terminating a student after just one semester of having 0 completed units, that we would align with the federal regulations and put that student on warning. We are an institution that we look at SAP after every semester, after every pay period. And so in that way, we just aligned with the federal regulation instead of being more strict, which was really, really important to us. And so next slide. So we also implemented some equity practices in our office. And so we wanted to really prioritize the most vulnerable students at Sierra College. And so in an effort to do that, the campus decided that they would hire staff using equity funds. And one of those staff members works directly with our disparate impacted students in our RISE program. And that person does all of the verification processing for students all the way from the first initial application of doing the FAFSA or the CADA, all the way through verification, and then also explaining to that student what their financial aid package is and what it can do for them and how they can leverage it the best way they can. The other person that was hired was myself to work with the foster youth that attend Sierra College and to be able to work within the foster youth support program. Now, by investing in more staff, we are able to uniquely and individually work with our students in a very intentional way to work with what they need. We can meet each student where they are because we know where they are. And we have the ability to have those really deep connections and communication with a student and to be able to help them from the very beginning of their journey. And I say journey through financial aid because it is a very confusing process. But because we're able to do that, myself and our other staff person is able to help them all the way from the beginning of applying to the FAFSA or the CADA, all the way through all of the things that could happen in between. The only thing, there's only a couple of things that we don't do for the student, but if we don't do it for them, we connect them, that warm handoff. And so it's super, super important. The other way that we were further able to prioritize our most vulnerable students is to train the other special programs technicians on our campus. So our campus has an EOPS program, we have a TRIO program, and we have a CalWorks program. And so all three of those programs, their program technicians that support the program are also trained in specific financial aid processes, not to the extent of a financial aid technician, but at least to the point where they can look at a student's financial aid and try and help them with the process and connect them to the right person. It also helps for the special programs technicians to be able to look and see what the program may be able to do to better serve the student. So one of the things that our programs are able to do is maybe give a little bit more of our direct services from our programs to a student if we know they have unmet need available. And so that's really important. So our special programs techs are trained to do things like that. The last investment in the financial aid office was to hire a functional IT tech in the financial aid office to programmatically improve processes. So one of the biggest issues in a financial aid office is having the ability to individually work with students or to utilize and leverage our programs that we have to use to meet the federal regulation. And it is absolutely necessary to be able to do that, because in a financial aid office, all of the things that we're trying to get to our students is insane. It's enormous. And the amount of manual process that we are required to do is an extreme task. And usually a task for the financial aid office of 5 or 6 people, maybe for the entire campus and all of the programs that are included. And so it's definitely a big ask. So by hiring our functional IT tech, we were able to utilize our program even more and really try and streamline a lot of processes where we could. Obviously, there's still going to be that manual processing. The programs that we're using for financial aid were really not designed to do all the things that we want to do now and that we're able to do now, and all of the grants that we're able to give, because they're more unique. And so, but the things that we are able to streamline, we have, so that we could, to give our attention in other areas, to more intentionally work with our students. And next slide.
So Brittany, we're pretty much at time, but I have a couple of questions in the last 30 seconds we have that people sent in that I just want to ask you. One question is, how do you review after every term, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how do you manage that logistically so that doesn't cause a delay in students receiving aid for the next term?
So the way that we have to do the timeline is that as soon as enough grades are posted from our faculty, and it really depends on our faculty on our campus to make sure that they enter grades in a timely fashion, because as soon as the grades are in and posted, we run SAP. And then the second that we run our SAP, we communicate to the students what their SAP status is, so that they can start to provide, if they have to petition, they start to provide that petition right then. That way there's minimal delay, if any at all. If we can avoid delays, we definitely try to do that.
Great. So I know we're at time. We have a bunch of policy recommendations that we're going to skip over, but they're all laid out in the report. I just want to mention to folks that if you're interested in diving deeper into this on your campus, we're going to be hosting a community of practice focused on evaluating and adapting and updating institutional SAP policies. And there's a link that was just posted in the chat to a form, and we'll send this out as well. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can click on that link and fill out our form, and we'll follow up with you. So thank you so much for being here, for sticking it out for the whole time, and we'll be following up via email. And have a great day, everyone.